Race is arguably the most divisive issue in the United States. Even though the biology of race has long been debunked as a myth, we continue to struggle with the term and with the function that race plays in the United States today. We've addressed the topic for years, and we've made progress, particularly through the legislation of the civil rights movement. Yet still, the topic is taboo, and it's considered politically inexpedient. In the words of former President Bill Clinton, the unfinished work of our time is to lift the burden of race and redeem the promise of America. His call nearly 23 years ago for a dialogue on race still resonates today. And we need to continue that dialogue, continue to learn, continue to move towards social and political action.
My name is Steve Bahls. I'm president of Augustana College. I've been president for 17 years, and during the last 17 years, I've watched the commitment of our students to social justice grow each year. I'm very proud of our students for their pursuit of social justice. It was 31 years ago that I stood before the Montana Supreme Court where I was sworn in as a lawyer. Part of the oath of office of lawyers in those days was to agree to improve justice, improve the laws, and to work hard to improve the administration of justice. I've been thinking about that oath that I took during the tragic events of this summer. And I've been thinking that it is time to renew my commitment to improving justice. Now, in my years as a lawyer and as an educator, I've seen how students working together can change systems for the better. Students, it is time for us now to work together in this important moment in our history to make sure that we realize the dream of racial justice, that we understand the process of social change. That's why I'm so proud of Augustana College and our faculty for organizing this teach-in. Students, I'd ask you to engage by understanding how our justice system impacts different people by looking at problems through the eyes of others. And I'd like you to ask yourself, how can collective action, students, faculty, and others, bring about that change so needed in our society? Because I remain an optimist. I am optimistic, students, that your generation will do what is necessary to continue the work of past generations as we seek to make sure that the American dream is available to all and that all can benefit in their own way from that dream. Thank you, students, for participating in the teach-in at Augustana College.
As Provost and Dean of the College at Augustana, I'm very proud of the way that our faculty have stepped up to take part in Scholars Strike. And it's no surprise that they have. In their personal and in their professional lives, so many of our faculty really live out the very learning outcomes that we desire in our students. Things like intercultural competence and also ethical citizenship, figuring out what you believe in and then not being afraid to get out there and really act upon it. So as you listen to our community members share some education around racial injustice, around police brutality, around white supremacy, I think you're going to hear passion in their voices because they, just like you, long for a world in which equality is possible for all people, especially around racial lines. Now, the education that you get at a liberal arts college is designed to prepare you for that career that comes after college, and that's certainly important. But let me also say, what we do here prepares you to be an engaged citizen in the world, to give you the very tools you need to go out and give voice to issues like racial inequality, police brutality, so that you have a way to fight back. So we are very pleased to be taking part in this Scholars Strike, and we are pleased that you have chosen to join us. Please enjoy our speakers.
Hi, thanks for tuning in the teach-in. My name is Paul Olsen. I'm with the English department at Augustana. And just today, I heard an interview with a guy who wrote a book about two teammates, Bill Russell for the Celtics and Bob Cousy for the Celtics. And in 1961, the Celtics, the black players on the Celtics team, sat out an exhibition game because they hadn't been served in a restaurant. The white players played. Cousy was one of those white players. Bill Russell was his friend. His entire life, he regretted that he didn't also sit out with the black players. He asked, "What was I thinking? Why didn't I speak up? Where was I when my friends needed me?" That bothered him. James Baldwin, in that majestic book, The Fire Next Time, says that learning and knowing and acting can lead to being larger, freer, and more loving. I think literature helps us do that. That's one of our roads towards learning and knowing and understanding. I'm going to read from two different sources to try to personalize the consequences of racial injustice and the history of our institutions and the history, actually, of our academic work as well. I'm going to start with Lorraine Hansberry's wonderful play, The Drinking Gourd. And the setting is this young boy, probably 19, is going to escape and run to the north. But he has a girl he loves, and she's trying to stop him. And it begins this way. "Hannibal! Hannibal!" And he sings back to her. "And when she comes to me, it were the moonrise. And when she touched my hand, it were the true stars fallen. Hannibal! What you always running off for all the time? You're going to catch you another whipping, boy." "I don't run off all the time." "Oh, Hannibal," he mocks her. "Oh, Hannibal, oh, Hannibal." And Sarah says, "What you got there?" "Hannibal, Master find you stole that Bible, you be in trouble bad." "Me and you was born in trouble with Master. What you think the Lord think of somebody who would steal the holy book itself?" "What you think I would do with the Bible, Sarah?" "Sarah, I can read it. I can read, Sarah. Listen, the book of Jeremiah." "Hannibal, you can't make them marks out for real. You done memorized from prayer meeting." "No, Sarah. And I said, 'Oh, that I had wings like a dove. Then would I fly away and be at rest.'" So that's where you go all the time. Somebody been learning you. Don't you know what they do to you if they finds out? Ain't nobody gonna find out. Don't you worry, little Sarah. Hey, look at there. What? Look at that big old fat star shining way up yonder there. Shh, Hannibal. 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, that makes up the dipper. That's the Big Dipper, Sarah. The old drinking gourd herself, pointing straight to the North Star. Sure is bright tonight. Sure would make good traveling light tonight. Stop it! Trees on this plantation got more ears than leaves. Up there, just pointing away, due north. You're sure like your brother, boy. Just like him. And Hannibal just sings. For the old man is a-waiting for to carry you to freedom if you follow the drinking gourd. Follow, follow, follow if you follow the drinking gourd. You look like him, you talk like him, and God knows you think like him. In time, I reckon, you'll be gone like him. You think Isaiah got all the way to Canada, Sarah? Yeah, sure he did. I bet you old Isaiah's up there and got himself a job and is living fine. I bet you that. I bet he works in a lumber yard or something and got himself a wife and maybe even a house. And you mean if he's alive, Hannibal? He's alive. He's alive, all right. He's alive and he's free. I met him here that night to bring the food and an extra pair of shoes. He was standing right over there with the moonlight streaming down on him, and he was breathing hard. Lord, that boy was breathing so you could almost hear him on the other side of the woods. He didn't say nothing to me. Nothing at all. I just handed him the parcel, and he put it in his shirt and gave me a kind of push on the shoulder here, and then he turned and lit out through them woods like lightning. He was bound out of this place. You aim to go, don't you, Hannibal? And how you know it's so much better to run off? And even if you make it, how you know what's up there, what it is to be like going wandering around by yourself in this world? I don't know. I just know what it is to be a slave. We all slaves, Hannibal. But there's some ain't got it so bad. Who knows how to bend a little? Then let 'em bend. Me, I'm the only kind of slave I could stand to be. A bad one. Every day that come, an hour that passed, that I got sense to make a half a step do for a whole. Every day that I can pretend sickness instead of health, to be stupid instead of smart, lazy instead of quick, I aims to do it. And the more pain it give master and the more it cost him, the more Hannibal be a man. Where would you go? Just north. That's all I know. Try to find Isaiah, maybe. How I know what I do? There's people up there that helps runaways. You mean those abolitionists? I heard Master Sweet say once they catches runaways and they make soap out of them. Oh, that slave owner talk, Sarah. Whatever you hear Master say about slavery, you always believe the opposite. The way I look at it, every slave ought to run off before he die. Oh, Hannibal, I couldn't go. I'm too delicate. My breath wouldn't hold out from here to the river. No, not you, skeer-fied as you is. But don't you worry, little Sarah. I'll come back. I'll come back and buy you. Mama, too, if she's still living. I surely do that thing. Slavery had its laws. Every state had a code about how to treat slaves. There were codes that numbered up to 10,000. And those codes shaped how people behaved in slavery, white people and black. And it's had consequences that take us right up to today's world. Another illustration of the human and the inhumane consequences of Jim Crow, one of the big legacies of slavery, is recorded in Richard Wright's wonderful collection of short stories, Uncle Tom's Children. And in the opening story, 4 boys, they're about 10 or 11, have just skipped school. And they've decided they're just going to wrestle and play, and they do. And they get dirty and sweaty, and they come upon a pond that has a sign beside it that says, "No trespassing." I'll remind any listener that in the 1950s, Emmett Till was murdered because they're not sure what he did, but he whistled or said hi to a white woman in Money, Mississippi. They beat him to death and threw him in the river. These boys, too, know what it is to, as their language would say, be messing with a white woman. The boys have been swimming. They're out on the land trying to dry off. Oh, they looked up, their lips parting. Oh, a white woman, poised on the edge of the opposite embankment, stood directly in front of them, her hat in her hand and her hair lit by the sun. "It's a woman," whispered Big Boy in an underbreath. "A white woman." They stared, their hands instinctively covering their groins. Then they scrambled to their feet. The white woman backed slowly out of sight. They stood for a moment looking at one another. "Let's get out of here," Big Boy whispered. "Wait till she goes away. No, let's run. They'll catch us here, naked like this. Maybe there's a man with her. Come on, let's get our clothes," said Big Boy. They waited a moment longer, listening. "Oh, what the hell? I'm going to get my clothes," said Big Boy. Grabbing at short tufts of grass, he climbed the embankment. "Don't run out there now! Come back, fool!" Bobo hesitated. He looked at Big Boy and then at Buck and Lester. "I'm going with Big Boy and get my clothes," he said. "No, don't run out there naked like this, fool! You don't know who's out there." Big Boy was climbing over the edge of the embankment. "Come on," he whispered. Bobo climbed after. 25 feet away, the woman stood. She had one hand over her mouth. Hanging by fingers, Buck and Lester peeped over the edge. "Come on back. That woman's scared," said Lester. Big Boy stopped, puzzled. He looked at the woman. He looked at the bundle of clothes. Then he looked at Buck and Lester. "Come on, let's get our clothes." He made a step. "Jim!" The woman screamed. Big Boy stopped and looked around. His hands hung loosely at his sides. The woman, her eyes wide, her hand over her mouth, backed away to the tree where their clothes lay in a heap. "Big Boy, come back and wait till she's gone." Bobo ran to Big Boy's side. "Let's go home. They'll catch us here." Big Boy's throat felt tight. "Lady, we just want to get our clothes," he said. Buck and Lester climbed the embankment and stood indecisively. Big Boy ran toward the tree. "Jim!" the woman screamed. "Jim! Jim!" Black and naked Big Boy stopped 3 feet from her. "We want to get our clothes," he said again, his words coming mechanically. He made a motion. "You go away! You go away, I tell you! You go away!" Big Boy stopped again, afraid. Bobo ran and snatched the clothes. Buck and Lester tried to grab theirs out of his hands. "You go away! You go away!" "Let's go," said Bobo, running toward the woods. Crack! That's Wright's representation of a rifle shot. Lester grunted, stiffened, and pitched forward. His forehead struck a toe of the woman's shoes. Bobo stopped, clutching the clothes. Buck whirled. Big Boy stared at Lester, his lips moving. "He's got a gun! He's got a gun!" yelled Buck, running wildly. Crack! Buck stopped at the edge of the embankment, his head jerked backward, his body arched stiffly to one side, and he toppled headlong, sending up a shower of bright spray of blood to the sunlight. The creek bubbled. Big Boy and Bobo backed away, their eyes fastened fearfully on a white man who was running toward them. He had a rifle and wore an army officer's uniform. He ran to the woman's side and grabbed her hand. "You hurt, Bertha? You hurt?" She stared at him and didn't answer. The man turned quickly. His face was red. He raised the rifle and pointed it at Bobo. Bobo ran back, holding the clothes in front of his chest. "Don't shoot me, mister! Don't shoot me!" Big Boy lunged for the rifle, grabbing the barrel. "You black son of a bitch!" Big Boy clung desperately. "Let go, you black bastard!" The barrel pointed skyward. Crack! The white man, taller and heavier, flung Big Boy to the ground. Bobo dropped the clothes, ran up, and jumped onto the white man's back. "You black sons of bitches!" The white man released the rifle, jerked Bobo to the ground, and began to batter the naked boy with his fists. Then Big Boy swung, striking the man in the mouth with the barrel. His teeth caved in, and he fell, dazed. Bobo was on his feet. "Come on, Big Boy, let's go." Breathing hard, the white man got up and faced Big Boy. His lips were trembling, his neck and chin wet with blood. He spoke quietly. "Give me that gun, boy." The episode doesn't end there, but that was the first African-American writer I had ever read. And I'd like to point out that at that point, I was done with a master's degree in American and English literature. I'd been at 3 different institutions, and I had never read a black writer, yet I had a master's degree in American and English literature. This story changed my life, and I wrote in the margins after that white man said, "Give me that gun, boy," to think that he would. Imagine the white superiority embedded in that man's history and into his own brain. Imagine the history embedded into the man's wife, who screamed and who was afraid of these 10-year-old boys. And imagine what's embedded in his head when he says, "Are you hurt, Bertha?" These are part of the stereotypes, the part of white power, the part of racist institutionalization that has creeped into every part of our living. And I'll take us back to Baldwin. When we learn, when we know, when we act, we begin to be freer, bigger, more loving. Thanks for taking part in this teach-in. Thanks for being a part of trying to make our world larger and bigger and more loving. I respect that you're here. I look forward to meeting some of you, and I hope you have a great day.
Hi, I'm Dr. Wolff from the Religion Department at Augustana College, and I teach on Christian theology and ethics. And my title for our time together today is Anti-Racism and Religion, and hopefully it will become apparent why I've put anti in parentheses. First, I want to say that I'm so glad you're here. This is a really exciting and unique moment in U.S. history, and you have a chance to be a part of it. Athletes are going on strike, celebrities are joining in, and you can also. Some of you, of course, have already been doing the work, and for a long time. Others are realizing the overwhelming policing of Black people in the United States for the first time. Now's the time to come together, to be willing to disrupt our routines and become part of a social justice movement. If an athlete in the WNBA who's been working her whole life to play this season can pause to say, there is something more important, there's something urgent that we must address in this country, why can't we? What does all of this have to do with religion? In the U.S. context, it is essential, not optional, to understand the role that Christianity specifically plays in perpetuating police brutality. What does the monastic cell have to do with the prison cell? What does the monastic cell and the prison cell have to do with healthcare and education? You don't have to be a scholar of religion to recognize that Christian theology has been used to authorize systemic racism. Black Africans who were captured were often baptized on slave ships before being sold. U.S. plantation slave owners would read aloud from the Bible. Slaves, submit to your masters, not only if they are kind and gentle, but also to the unjust and cruel. It can be tempting to think that religion's the problem. Maybe if we got rid of religion, people would be free and equal. To that, I offer two responses. First, if you, like me, are a person of faith, you are obligated to assess how your tradition has perpetuated racism. Second, if you're not a person of faith, you will be hard-pressed to advance anti-racism if you dismiss religious people of any tradition as foolish, superstitious, or uninformed. In other words, in order to speak to your own community, your family members, your friends, strangers, people who adhere to faith in some way, it is essential that you are able to communicate respectfully, that you dignify their deeply held beliefs, and one way of addressing racism in the Christian tradition as it relates to this U.S. context is to familiarize yourself with the history of that tradition, what people in that community hold as sacred. Because when you speak from within what someone holds as most authoritative in their lives, you're better equipped to build a bridge and invite them in to anti-racist action. Of course, this is easier said than done. So, how does one even begin to dismantle systemic racism? This is a huge problem. It's bigger than you. The problem involves you, but it is not your individual problem. It is a problem that involves all of us. The problem is systemic. U.S. culture is a powerful force. It is a river current that wants to carry you with it. Even standing your ground is difficult. Pushing against it is pointless on your own. If you're committed to change, if you want to dismantle white supremacy, to stop police brutality, to exorcise the demons of racism in this country, we need to act together. So how do we do that? Where do we even begin? If you've been going to protests and posting on social media, that's great, but it's not enough. Remember, this is much bigger than any one of us, and we cannot go it alone. So let's talk about what we can do practically. I'm going to suggest one thing that you can do, but it's not an easy thing, and you're not going to be able to go it alone. I would like to challenge each and every one of you to center Black women. What do I mean by this? Let me begin with what I do not mean. First, centering Black women is not a mere addition of one reading authored by a Black woman to a class, for example. It is not a sprinkle here or there, a nod in one direction. It means for those of you who are educators to consider building your entire course around the scholarship and voices and insights of Black women. Second, centering Black women does not mean to evaluate or argue with Black women's experiences, voices, or demands. Again, this is hard. Higher education is built on the interrogation of ideas and debates through logic and reason, but now is not the time for hostility. Most of you are not ready to do that evaluative work because you haven't first valued or affirmed Black women's voices. Third, centering Black women is not a demand for reconciliation, particularly if you are white. You might be feeling really uncomfortable right now. All this talk of racism might have you feeling defensive that you personally haven't committed a hate crime. And again, this is not about you as an individual. Ego has to be checked at the door. Instead of centering your feelings or your discomfort, now is the time to center Black women. And Black women have been calling for reparations, not reconciliation. Okay, so if centering Black women is not merely an addition, a perspective to evaluate, or an attempt at reconciliation, what is it? I would like to suggest that first, you must listen. You need to listen to Black women. And listening might entail hearing a criticism of U.S. culture, that strong river current that wants to pull you with it. It might make you uncomfortable. It might scare you, but stop and listen. Second, affirm. In my Christian ethics course, we have this big word, epistemology. And epistemology is how we know something. How do you know something to be true? What makes it authoritative? Is it statistics, emotional authenticity, shared experience, logic, reason? In our society, and again, hear me describing the river, not any one of you acting alone. In our society, we don't tend to listen to Black women's voices. or to see them as credible. We're too quick to cast judgment and disbelief. And this is almost never a conscious or intentional action. What makes it so powerful is that it's a passive response. It is to float on your back downriver. It is a posture that so many people around you take. And so it's tempting to give in, to be like the masses that surround us. And in fact, to do otherwise is to position yourself in a state of vulnerability. You too will be discredited. You might be punished or ostracized. It's tempting to flow with the current. It's easy, and you'll be rewarded for doing that. Third, centering Black women means for many of us to take direction. Who are the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement? They are Black queer women: Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometri, Alicia Garza. 17 years ago, these women initiated a political intervention into the systematic killing of Black lives. And from the onset, Black Lives Matter was unapologetically womanist, trans, and queer. Who initiated the athletic strikes? Black women in the NBA. 4 years ago, WNBA players wore warm-up suits with a similar message about police brutality and were fined $500 a player. Black women have been doing the work. Who initiated the scholar strike? The whole reason that we're here together today. Anthea Butler, a Black woman, a religion scholar no less. Professor Butler researches gender and race in the Christian tradition. She is the reason we are striking today. Black women are doing the work. Black women are on the front lines. Black women deserve to be seen, celebrated, and followed. And if you are part of the Black Lives Matter movement and do not take direction from Black women, what are you doing? One way that the Augie community can demonstrate our commitment to anti-racism is to listen to Black women like Monica Smith. We can affirm her assessment of our community and take direction from her as to what needs to change. Listen, affirm, take direction. How might your life look if you centered Black women? Who would be your heroes? Where would your resources go? What sacrifices would you be willing to make? Before I go, I would be remiss if I did not remind you of the role of religion. Although Christian theology has been used to authorize racism in the United States, it is a profound resource for resistance. Religion expands our collective imagination. It allows us to think otherwise. Faith communities recognize a power larger than themselves, and rather than shoring that power up for oneself, what if we re-examine sacred texts and traditions? What if we listen to Black women's interpretations? What if we affirmed Black women's experiences in the Christian church, for example? What if we took direction from Black women of faith? As many of you know who have taken classes with me, I find that womanist ethicists, theologians, and biblical scholars, that is to say Black women, offer the most effective resources for dismantling the Goliath that is white supremacy and racism in the U.S. context. With that, I'd like to leave you with a poem written by a Black queer womanist ethicist, Emily Towns. It's untitled. To be called beloved is to be called by God. To be called by the shining moments, to be called deep within deep. To be called beloved is more than 1 plus infinity, more than the millions of breaths of loving, than the sounds of tomorrow's horizon. To be called beloved is the marvelous yes to God's what if. The radical shifting of growth, mundane agency of active faith. To be called beloved is to ask the question, what would it mean? What would it look like if we actually believed that we are washed in God's grace? To be called beloved is to answer the question. We are not dipped. We are not sprinkled. We are not immersed. We are washed in the grace of God. To be called beloved is to listen to the words of baby Suggs, holy, who offered up to them, us, her great big heart. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Eric Stewart from the Religion Department at Augustana College. I'd like to spend a few minutes with you today discussing the possibilities for decolonizing religious studies. The academic study of religion, like all academic disciplines, has a history. It does not arise from nowhere, and yet it is not always obvious what the objects and subjects of such studies are. It is important to acknowledge in this discipline, as in all others, the peoples, places, and things that we study are chosen, with greater or lesser care, within an already existing set of boundaries. As we think about religious studies within the confines of a teach-in about racial justice, it is important that we acknowledge how the creation of the discipline is implicated in European colonialist enterprises and what that means for whose interests the discipline represents. Religion, for most Americans today, is a voluntary practice undertaken, or not, by individuals due to their own understandings and beliefs about the nature of sacred beings and these beings' relation to reality. In other words, religion is non-compulsory, though some children might object to such a characterization, and centered on the beliefs of an individual. The definition on this slide, though admittedly scholarly in terms of its language, reflects the notion that the quintessence of religion is the beliefs, here in terms of conceptions, which serve to create moods and motivations of the individual. Religion is, in a word, interiorized in the most common understandings among present-day inhabitants of the United States. Religion has not always been understood in this way. As we can see from the quotations on this slide, when European colonialists first arrived in the Americas, in this case the Canary Islands and Peru, our earliest written records of these encounters show that the Europeans adjudged the natives not to have religion. Within a century of these judgments, treatises were being written describing the religions of the indigenous peoples. In the intervening period, the ritual practices of the native peoples of the Americas had not changed significantly. It was the understanding of what counted as religion in the minds of European colonizers that had changed. Jonathan Z. Smith has rightfully articulated that religion is not a native category. It is a comparative category imposed from the outside. It is, in the modern day, most often a category used by scholars or by people who want to make comparisons between those things they designate religion, between and among cultures. Smith calls religion a second-order concept used for establishing disciplinary boundaries. Talal Asad, reacting to the definition of Geertz we examined before, notes that the notion that religion is interiorized and primarily a matter of belief comes from a very specific historical and discursive process related to the Enlightenment in Europe. In the course of introducing a new kind of public discourse based upon the principles of observation rather than revelation, the initial steps were taken to move religion from a public element of society to a private matter of individual belief and conscience. It is in these steps that the notion of the secular is created, according to Assad, and he argues that this shift is not particularly helpful in understanding cultures that are not predominantly Christian. This shift did not occur all in one step, but it significantly influenced the way that European colonizers conceived of religion when they encountered indigenous peoples around the world. Assad, moreover, argues that the notion that religion, as a fundamental feature of what it means to be human, found in the notion of natural religion, or Kant's notion that there is one true religion of which all historical enactments are vehicles, which may vary with differences in time and place, is one that can only arise in this period in European history. This type of Platonic form of religion, which for Kant includes religious texts, is one that, for Assad, has a specifically Christian character that elides questions about processes of power and knowledge. Assad argues that to segment society into secular and religious only makes sense in Western European and North American contexts. In fact, this understanding of religion is at the root of European and North American difficulties in understanding majority Muslim cultures for Assad. The notion that religion is located primarily in the belief of the individual only arises in European thinking at the same time as modern science, modern production, and the modern state. This way of understanding religion hides the operations of power inherent in these shifts and locates religion outside the public sphere. Tomoko Masuzawa has described the development of the concept of world religions in her book, The Invention of World Religions. Among the most important points she makes in this book is describing the period before the idea of world religions arose as one in which the religions of indigenous peoples, quite regularly called savages in that period, were lumped together as all belonging to the same basic pre-literate and pre-rational type. These societies, when compared by European scholars to Europe, were seen as simple, backward, and infantile. Moreover, because these tribal cultures were seen as representing a pre-rational phase of human existence, and the 19th and early 20th century anthropologists adopted a developmental framework for understanding human culture, these tribal cultures were seen as relics of a bygone era. When the notion of world religions developed in the early 20th century, these cultures' religions did not count as world religions because they were not deemed living religions in the sense of religions that had overcome tribal origins to be more ethnically expansive. Indigenous practices, worldviews, beliefs, divine beings, and histories, notably because such histories were not written in canonical divine books, were not part of the study of the world religions. Masuzawa further tells us that, as part of the creation of the concept of world religions, Christianity was the first to be labeled a world religion. This fact is due to the presumed superiority of Christianity by Europeans in the second half of the 19th century. Not only was Christianity considered superior, however, a simultaneous understanding of human progress and development anticipated the end of religion, or at least its transformation to limit its influence over those areas of life considered secular. So some of the very same people stressing the superiority of religion were also anticipating the end of religion. A corollary is that these scholars of religion painted other peoples, non-Europeans, along with poor and uneducated members of their own societies, as under the sway of this backward concept called religion. These 19th century thinkers, among whom are included theological comparativists, adjudged all other religious traditions besides Christianity to be particular, bound, and shaped by geographical, ethnic, and other local contingencies. For this reason, the question of the place of Jews and Muslims in European society, also known as Christendom, became a lively topic of conversation, leading to all kinds of racist vitriol. In fact, it is in the attempt to distinguish Christianity as an Indo-European or Aryan tradition through its relation to Greek culture that the Semitic origins of Judaism and Islam come to be stressed. This move has the effect of both a supersessionist approach to Judaism, signaling that Christianity overcomes its Jewish roots, and a limiting of Muslims to an Arabian religion, even though then, as now, most Muslims in the world did not live in the Arabian Peninsula. The history of my discipline is overwhelmingly colonialist. The very notion that religion exists in all cultures in the world is a creation of 17th, 18th, and 19th century European colonizers. The notion that some of these aggregations of actions, relationships, histories, artifacts, and symbolic systems form the great religions of the world is a creation of the 20th century. What would it mean to decolonize such a discipline? It might mean at least two things. Mallory Nye distinguishes between two senses of decolonizing a discipline. The first he labels soft decolonizing. This type of decolonizing stresses the inclusion of more diverse voices within the academic study of religion, studying a broader range of peoples, practices, and places. A hard decolonizing is a much more difficult undertaking. It would threaten the very existence of a discipline whose origins are so deeply embedded in the colonialist enterprise. At the very least, Nye argues that decolonization must mean that scholars are aware of how their disciplines and institutions are implicated in colonializing projects. It's worth pausing at this point to ask the so what question. Why does any of this matter in an age in which we have come to stress interfaith cooperation on Augustana's campus? I have likely overwhelmed you with information in this brief presentation, perhaps information which you were not keen to learn in the first place. Yet, I think there are some very clear payoffs to knowing this type of thing. First, the place of Jews and Muslims within the framework of world religions has changed significantly in the 20th and 21st centuries. Yet we still often see remnants of the framework that treats the participants in these two traditions as backward and a threat to the United States and its culture. Examples abound, and they often involve violence. Two recent examples of horrifying othering of Jewish people came in the form of members of Unite the Right shouting, "Jews will not replace us," in August of 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the dreadful killing of 11 members of the Tree of Life Synagogue just over 1 year later in October of 2018 in Pittsburgh. The shooter in the synagogue shooting claimed particular inspiration from John 8:44, which he claimed means that Jews are children of Satan. Obviously, most scholars of religion would never participate in these types of violent demonstrations and actions. There is a long history, however, of Christian understanding of Jews, influenced as it is by caricatures of Jewish leaders and people in the Christian Gospels, that suggests that Jews are legalistic. Descriptions of Judaism as a tribal religion in the 18th, 19th, and into the 20th century have surely helped to exacerbate a Christian understanding that Judaism is represented both fully and fairly in the Christian Gospels, making it not unlike other tribal religions that do not count as living religions. While most Christians are not overtly anti-Judaic or anti-Semitic, the legacy of understanding of Judaism as parochial, legalistic, and other continues to exert a profound effect on our understandings of Judaism. The very notion that members of the Unite the Right group can chant, "Jews will not replace us," leads us to ask the question, who is us? And why aren't Jews a part of that us? To be clear, I have no sympathy for the Unite the Right, nor any other white supremacist group, but we hear echoes of long-standing problematic understandings of the notion of religion in their chant. With respect to Muslims, I don't think it is difficult to find examples of Islamophobia. Especially in the wake of the terrible attacks of September 11th, 2001, Americans asked one another whether Islam was at war with the West. This type of Islamophobia, coupled with an almost total ignorance of Muslim practices, led to the death of Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh gas station owner in Mesa, Arizona, who was mistaken for a Muslim by his shooter. Significantly, the notion that Muslims are all Arabs, along with other problematic stereotypes we heard about from Tomoko Masuzawa previously, have also limited our appreciation of Muslims' place in U.S. history. There were Muslims in America before America was officially a nation, and they have contributed much to the history and culture of this nation. On the place of Muslims in America, see Amir Hussein's very fine book, Muslims and the Making of America. Finally, lumping together indigenous peoples' religions into one category has meant that historians of religion have not always taken seriously self-reports and self-understandings of indigenous peoples. More problematically, the academic study of religion has involved far too few indigenous scholars. We, and by that I mean people like me, have far too often spoken for them in their place. Decolonizing religion, at a minimum, ought to mean a reconsideration of how we conceive of their own self-understandings. Also, it should lead us to asking the question of whether religion is the right category to understand meaningfully anything that happens in indigenous communities. If the category is not a native one, we have to build a clear justification for using it that takes into account its colonialist history. It may be that we can find no such justification. In the end, I want to say that I've learned these things about my discipline only in the last several years. I tell you that both to acknowledge that no one can know everything, and that I am bound by my sense of racial justice to do this work. To the extent that I do not do it, I participate in a racist, colonialist discourse that has profound and sometimes fatal effects on people who are not in the majority in this country. The time and energy it takes to do this work is a very small price to pay to attempt to disrupt those effects.
Hi, my name is Jane Simonsen, and I teach history and gender studies at Augustana College. And I have a story for you about white settlers and slavery in the Quad Cities. The story I'm going to tell you first comes from a book called Early Rock Island that was written in 1905 by a lawyer and historian named William Meese, who lived in Moline. It's from a chapter called The First and Only Slaves. Here's the story. In May blank, it doesn't say the year, a man named Stevens from St. Louis settled on the Mississippi, 2 miles east of Moline, bringing with him 20 black slaves and built 2 cabins. There were but few settlers in this locality, but this new departure was not in accordance with their ideas, and in October, Joseph Danforth, a settler, traveled to the nearest justice of the peace, who resided in Galena, and secured from him a warrant for Stevens' arrest for holding slaves. George Goebel, another settler, knowing Danforth's intention, warned Stevens, who immediately started south with his slaves. No one after this ever tried to own slaves in this county, although some of the officers at Fort Armstrong had Negro servants who were held as indentured blacks. So, what meaning should we make of this story, and especially of the actions of the white settlers? One who presumably went to warn an official in Galena that slaves had been brought into the territory, and another who warned the slave owner to leave with his slaves. What were their motives? The historian in me knows that the sorts of questions that we ask about evidence, when was it written, what was the context, and is it true, that suggests that there's something about this story that doesn't seem quite right. So I followed up. Here's a different version of the story. This one's from a county history called The Past and Present of Rock Island County that was presumably written by a group of historians. There's no name attached. It was written in 1877. It goes like this. In 1829, a number of slaves were held for a short time in Rock Island County on a plantation just above Moline. A man whose name I've not been able to ascertain came here from Louisiana with about 75 slaves. His purpose in bringing them here was to give them their freedom and settle them on land in this section. But they preferred to return to Louisiana, and did so after remaining here about a year. The contextual evidence of these stories suggests to me that the white settlers in the area weren't necessarily opposed to slavery. In fact, the slave owner from Louisiana seems more intent on freedom for enslaved people than those folks living in Moline. There seemed, however, to be some concern about the presence of Black folks in the area. Concern enough that one man would go to warn the official that there was African American people living in the area, and another one who would warn the slave owner that he ought to leave if presumably he intended to keep his property. Both of these white settlers seem to be engaged in some way in policing the presence of Black people in the county. It's probably no coincidence that the incident in Moline happened in 1829. This was the very year that white settlers moved into homes that the Sauk people had left while on their winter hunt, and began to protect their livestock and cornfields that had belonged to the Sauk with the force of arms. 3 years later, those same farmers and miners from Galena who took over Meskwaki lead mines joined together to push indigenous people west of the Mississippi in the violent conflict we called the Black Hawk War. While Southerners began to organize citizen militias, the foregoers of modern police departments, to protect themselves from Black rebellions in the wake of Nat Turner's revolt, white Midwesterners organized to keep their states white. We tend to think of the sorts of policing that we associate with white control over Black bodies with Southern states, where there were enslaved people and the white owners and community members were afraid that those folks might escape. But Midwestern states, like Illinois and like Iowa, had a different kind of policing that was going on. Because it was illegal to enslave other human beings, but because white Midwesterners, many of whom were migrants from the eastern and southern parts of the United States, had a difficult time separating the presence of Black bodies with the sorts of connotations of subservience, laziness, and even illegality that they associated with people who had been enslaved. So it's important to remember that states such as Illinois, while slavery was illegal and had been even before Illinois became a state in 1818, still, unfortunately, had people who were enslaved. Part of this is because Illinois inherited a territory where it had been legal to enslave people. For example, St. Louis, and East St. Louis is in Illinois, had been part of France and then Spain, where both African American and indigenous people were enslaved. So when Illinois became a state, there was concern that those people who owned other human beings who lived in mostly the southern part of the state would lose their so-called property as a result of the law. So they came up with a compromise. People who were enslaved needed to be converted to indentured servants within a certain amount of time, or the people who claimed them as servants would face heavy fines. Now, it was believed that those people should be consenting to be indentured servants, but even lawyers at the time understood that a person who was living under slavery was not fully able to consent to their own servitude. Nonetheless, these contracts took effect, and people could be indentured for a period of time from 1 year up to, in some cases, 99 years. Now, this meant that there were Black people in Illinois, some of whom were enslaved for life, some of whom were enslaved for a period of years. Some of them were children of people who had been enslaved, who could be indentured until they were adults. This meant that many of the white citizens of Illinois needed to keep careful track of those people, and so they instituted what are called Black laws. A lot of these are similar to what we see in the American South in the wake of the Civil War, where white citizens were interested in policing and criminalizing the behaviors of African American people. So in Illinois, and later in Iowa, when it became a state, there were heavy fines imposed on Black people who were unable to produce papers to show that they were free. There were restrictions on their movements and their abilities to gather. So these laws were in place in our own Midwestern states, in some cases even decades before the black codes that we associate with Jim Crow in the South took effect in those states in the wake of the Civil War. This anti-black legislation is perhaps even more noticeable in my state, Iowa, which didn't have enslaved people to the extent that Illinois did, although there were enslaved people on the Iowa side as well, individual traders and merchants who brought African American people up north and across the river. When Iowa thought of itself as a territory and then a state, it thought of itself in part as a white state, forged out of the elimination of people of color. First, indigenous nations, including the Sauk, Meskwaki, and Dakota, and then, later on, African Americans, some of whom came seeking freedom from southern states or parts of Illinois where enslaved people still were. At its first territorial legislature in 1838, the new territory of Iowa passed an act to regulate blacks and mulattoes. In general, the idea behind these was their concern that African American people would become a burden on society. The folks in Iowa and other Midwestern states saw African American people as workers, but didn't see them as valuable laborers, as dependable laborers, as they thought themselves. So anyone who wanted to come to Iowa, an African American person who wanted to be free, needed to pay a $500 bond. This was almost too much for anyone to pay at the time. If they were unable to pay it, they would be hired out for 6 months at least. This was, in fact, a way of keeping a de facto form of enslavement. This doesn't mean that African American people didn't find freedom in Iowa and Illinois. In fact, they did so, and against incredible odds, and against the attempts of a number of white settlers to keep them from doing so. I know that the story that a lot of places, including the Quad Cities, like to tell ourselves is that we've always been a free place. We never had slavery. We were on the side of right in the Civil War, and perhaps we were. But these two states that bordered on slave-owning states made a concerted effort to keep their states white by constructing an idea of black people, whether enslaved or free, as potential criminals and public burdens. These ideas continued even after the Civil War, when Iowans and Illinoisians became concerned that freed people would seek new lives in their states. And well into the 1870s and 1890s, you see reports in Quad City newspapers that express concerns about black people in their midst and the criminality of those people. In fact, the way that this story changes over time, and the ways that both historians shape the truth to cover up the culpability of white settlers, is part of the lesson. In 1877, the historian noted that the Louisianan had brought people to Illinois because he wanted to free them. But he suggests that people who were enslaved chose to return to bondage, omitting that Illinois at the time created significant barriers intended to discourage freed people from seeing it as a refuge. In 1904, Mies changes the story, adapting it to the political views of his own time. He presents the owner as the villain and the citizens of Moline as rejecting the stain of slavery, rather than the more likely concern that they viewed freed people as potential public burdens and likely criminals. So what's the lesson for white Midwesterners like me? We need to reckon with the realities of white folks' collaboration in policing black bodies in our own states, both before and after the Civil War. Our complicity in this history is not that we ourselves necessarily were engaged in this policing or even our ancestors, but that the ideas that come with this history are ones that we're still grappling with and that still inform the ways that white folks understand and apprehend Black people and Black bodies, and that Black people are still living with. This is one of the reasons why this ungrappled with history is probably causing the unrest, the pain, the violence in so many Midwestern cities in the last 5 years. Ferguson, Minneapolis, Kenosha. It's time for all of us to reckon with these histories.
Good morning. My name is Chris Strunk, and I'm an associate professor in the Geography Department and co-coordinator of the Latin American and Latinx Studies program at Augustana. I'm coming to you from outside my house, which is why you might hear some cicadas and birds during this. But I wanted to talk to you as part of the racial justice teach-in this week about some of the ways that urban geographers and historians are contributing to anti-racist work by mapping historical patterns of housing discrimination, and to think about why this matters in our current moment. A key aspect of the struggle for racial justice in the United States is understanding the impact of racial segregation on the health and well-being of people of color. And those of you who've spent time in the United States, you know that almost every city in the United States is deeply segregated. In my hometown, St. Louis, we have something called the Del Mar Divide, and this represents the sharp division between North St. Louis, which is almost entirely African American, and neighborhoods in the south part of the city that are much wider. I'll show you a map here of, it's a racial dot map, and it provides a visualization of the extreme segregation in the city. The blue dots represent African American population. The bluer it is, the greater concentration of African Americans. And you can see here along that this boulevard, Del Mar Boulevard, we have, to the north, much blacker population, and to the south, a much wider population. This divide has lots of implications, both in terms of a pretty stark racial wealth gap and differences in opportunities for people living in these communities, but also how Black and white communities are perceived and policed differently. And it's no accident that the Black Lives Matter movement started in Ferguson, which is a suburb just to the north of the city of St. Louis that quickly became a majority Black suburb in recent decades as a result of white flight, and where local officials and police officers were extracting revenue from residents during police stops that targeted African Americans disproportionately, including people like Michael Brown. Here in Rock Island, we have a similar racial divide. Residents on the Illinois side of the river in the Quad Cities often make distinctions between wealthier communities that are above the hill and poorer communities that are below the hill in areas near the Mississippi River. And a map of Rock Island would show us a similar concentration of African American residents in certain neighborhoods in the west part of the city and below the hill. What I want to do today is show you a couple different mapping projects. I'll start with this one. That help us to understand how urban landscapes came to be this way. And these patterns of spatial segregation that I'm going to talk to you about today are they're not natural, and they're not an accident. Instead, they are the result of intentional government policies that have been developed throughout U.S. history, and I'm going to focus particularly on the 20th century today. One of the primary ways that government officials, real estate agents, and individual homeowners enforced segregation in the 20th century were through restrictive covenants, which were agreements that made it illegal to sell property to certain groups of people. And these covenants were often just a few lines in warranty deeds, and they prohibited homeowners from selling properties to African Americans, oftentimes, or anybody who was not a member of the Caucasian race. And here we have on this website, which is called Mapping Prejudice, put together by a group of scholars and community activists and students at the University of Minnesota to explore these issues in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities area. This covenant shows that a property in Hennepin County, where Minneapolis is, shows that the land and the buildings cannot be sold, transferred, or offered to any people who were quote unquote a Negro or colored person. These racial covenants were enforced by local governments until the Shelley v. Kramer decision, Supreme Court decision, in 1948, but they continue to be used for decades. And what I'd like to do is sort of show you what this map does and what it allows us to understand about these forms of racial segregation in cities like Minneapolis, but many others across the country. Using these maps, we can start to understand why the Twin Cities is such a segregated metro area and why there's such a large gap between black and white communities in Minneapolis and the surrounding area. The typical black family in the Twin Cities metro area earns less than half as much as the typical white family in any given year. And this is the second largest racial wealth gap in the United States among big cities. Only the Milwaukee metro area, where Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back by police officers in suburban Kenosha last month, has a larger income gap between black and white residents. And so in Minneapolis, before these restrictive covenants were adopted, the city was actually not particularly segregated. These racially restrictive deeds were put in place preemptively in order to limit where African Americans could live in the city, and they resulted in almost entirely white neighborhoods in much of the city. By the 1950s, and I'm going to show you the progression of these restrictive covenants, and you can see they sort of start out very in just a few places, sort of in the early 20th century, and then by the 1950s, there were more than 30,000 restrictive covenants in Hennepin County alone. And researchers have found about 22,000 so far, and these are actually archived and accessible on this website, so you can actually click and find individual restrictive covenants mapped to where they were located in the Twin Cities and read more about each of these. Researchers expect to find about 10 to 15,000 more and continue updating the site. Mapping projects like this show us why we can't separate this history and the deeply segregated urban geography that we have in cities from the outrage over the death of George Floyd earlier this year in Minneapolis. And many of the neighborhoods that had restrictive covenants in the 20th century, early to mid 20th century, these are some of the whitest places in the Twin Cities today. On average, Minneapolis neighborhoods that had restrictive covenants are 79% white today, while the city as a whole is only 53% white. The other reason that this matters is that restrictive covenants were often put in place at the edges of black neighborhoods. And areas along the edges of black and white spaces in Minneapolis were places where black residents were often subjected to abusive police practices. In fact, Kirsten Delegard, the director of Mapping Prejudice, points out that the intersection of Chicago and 38th Street, and I'll zoom in here so we can see it a little bit closely. This intersection right here, Chicago and 38th, is where a police officer kneeled on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And she argues that this space is representative of these kinds of racial tensions and these boundaries between different spaces that were designated for one racial group or another. And so while the neighborhood to the west, all the way towards the highway that actually displaced a lot of African American residents, this area was used to be known as the Old South Side. And it was the hub of the black community in Minneapolis during the mid-20th century. But as we can see on this map, a number of the houses near the intersection where George Floyd was killed by a police officer actually had restrictive covenants. And so we can click on these and see that this is from 1919. No lot in this edition, it says, nor any part thereof, should be sold or leased to colored persons. And so we can see that again, there's this edge where black spaces were very close or bordered spaces that had these restrictive covenants that prohibited African Americans from purchasing, and policing practices often were used to keep African Americans out of these spaces. And we see how this continues to be relevant today. Another project, this time put together by researchers at the University of Richmond, reveals the history of redlining. And redlining is the practice of denying borrowers access to credit based on the location of properties in communities of color oftentimes, or in other economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. And beginning in the 1930s, federal housing policies promoted homeownership by subsidizing the costs of suburbanization. And by refinancing and creating low-interest and long-term mortgages, federal housing agencies like the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration made it cheaper to buy a new home in the suburbs than to fix up an older home in the central city. And this really sort of set the stage for the suburbanization and helps us understand why our cities and suburbs look the way they do. But as historians like Ira Katz-Nelson and Richard Rothstein have shown, these federal loans and subsidized mortgages went almost exclusively to white people. And not only were African Americans almost entirely excluded from these programs, but federal agencies also financed entire subdivisions on the condition that the suburb only be available for white families, or they blocked funding for developers that were trying to create integrated projects. And a lot of the focus on these federal policies that were intentionally discriminatory has focused on these redlining maps created initially by the HOLC, the Home Ownership Loan Corporation. And during the 1930s, they created these residential security maps in many cities around the country, using a system of appraisal methods that were based on the occupation and income and race of inhabitants in the neighborhood, and also the age and the sort of general state of repair of the housing stock in the neighborhood. And the HOLC gave 4 security grades. You can see them here. That A was the best, B was still desirable, C definitely declining, and D hazardous in red. And that's where that term redlining comes from. These security grades undervalued dense mixed use and older neighborhoods, oftentimes now the kind of neighborhoods that are increasingly valued and are sites of gentrification in central cities. But these were places where real estate agents undervalued these homes and often refused to give loans and those increasingly subsidized federal loans for housing, new housing developments, or for refinancing improvements to old houses. Those were the sites in red were often the sites that did not receive any funding. And this mapping inequality site is an amazing one. It shows these old HOLC maps, and it overlays them on top of current city maps with streets and building outlines. And I'm going to zoom into Davenport, right across the river from where we are. And it's a digital archive too, so it actually shows us it allows us to examine these old maps and to see why certain neighborhoods were given ratings. So I'll click on one here. This is one of the so-called hazardous neighborhoods, Davenport, located on the east side. And it says, in explaining why there was this rating was given, it says that there were quote-unquote colored people in this district. And so this is associated with decline, with a risk to investors. And there's some debate about whether how much, let me scroll out again, how much these maps were actually used by real estate agents, but it's clear that the maps represented how agents viewed cities at the time and how neighborhoods of color were often denied access to loans and capital investment. And so this map sort of allows us to visualize the continued relevance of these 20th century housing policies. These maps and other housing policies contributed to white flight, to disinvestment in urban black communities, and ultimately to the stark racial gap that we have in the U.S. today. And so I would say these maps sort of allow scholars and students to explore the history of housing discrimination in their neighborhoods and to make connections between these histories and structural inequalities based on race that continue to this day.
Let America be America again. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. Let America be the dream that dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great strong land of love, where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark? And who are you that draws your veil across the stars? I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek, and finding only the same old stupid plan. Of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. I am the young man full of strength and hope. I am the young woman full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient, endless chain of profit, power, gain, of grab the land, of grab the gold, of grab the ways of satisfying need, of work the men, of take the pay, of owning everything for one's own greed. I am the farmer, bondsman to the soil. I am the worker sold to the machine. I am the black body, servant to you all. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean. Hungry yet today despite the dream, beaten yet today, O pioneers. I am the man who never got ahead, the poorest worker battled through the years. Yet, I'm the one who dreamt our basic dream, and the old world while still serf of kings, who dreamt a dream so strong, so brave, so true, that even yet its mighty daring sings. In every brick and stone, in every furrow turn, that's made America the land it has become. Oh, I'm the man, I'm the woman, who sailed those early seas, in search of what I meant to be my home. For I'm the one who left dark Ireland's shore, and Poland's plain, and England's grassy lea, and torn from black Africa's stand I came, to build a homeland for all to be free. The free? Who said the free? Not me. Not Michael Brown. Not Tamir Rice. Not George Floyd. Not Breonna Taylor. Surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shot down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we've dreamed, and all the songs we've sung, and all the hopes we've held, and all the flags we've hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay, except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be the land where every man, woman, and child is free. The land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, the Negro, me. Who made America? Whose sweat and blood and whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me an ugly name you choose, whatever you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain. From those who live like leeches on the people's lives, we must take back our land again, America. Oh yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath America will be. Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we the people must redeem and rise. The land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, all the stretch of these great, great green states, and make America again. Hello, my name is Kam Williams, and I am the director of the Office of Disability Services here at Augustana College. What I just shared with you was a poem by my favorite poet, the late and great Langston Hughes, who was a Black body that existed during the Harlem Renaissance, who was an activist and prolifically profound and beyond his time when it came to expressing what us as Black men and women and children go through in a country called America. Langston always spoke about the value, seeing, and respect of our experiences here in America. So you've got to ask yourself this question: how could Langston have written that years, decades ago, and it still be so relevant to today when it comes to discussing this beautiful land of America? But when I say that, is it really beautiful for all? Is it really fair for all? I shared some names with you of many other countless names of Black persons who used to live and breathe and walk and occupy their bodies, but are no longer at the hand of others who were a part of America that felt they were justified in taking the life out of those Black bodies. If we look at the definition of value, according to the dictionary, that is to cherish. If we look at the definition of seeing, that's to perceive visually or discern someone or something. And if you look at that great word called respect, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, that is to admire and adore someone or something. Body's definition is the entire physical makeup, structure of a person, from their skin to their lips, to their nose, to their eyes, to their mind, to their heart, to their soul, to the very breath that they're allowed to breathe and take in. But to value, see, and respect someone who is different from you is to hold all of those elements of a person's body as special and priceless. We are in a time of America where America is not America for anyone that looks like me, that looks like Freddie Gray. We as Americans have to take back the rightful position of valuing, seeing, and respecting the experiences of the Black, brown, white, red person. But in particular, with what's going on in our society today, valuing, seeing, and respecting my Black body, my experiences. We can look at racial profiling and see the lack and undervalue. We can look at when it comes to job discrimination. Statistically, I don't even have to pull them up, that when it comes to Black and brown people in America, whether it's white collar or blue collar, we lack, right? We are undervalued when it comes to advancement, to promotions, to leading in every way. I often get asked these questions from friends outside of the institution of all races that are trying to understand what's going on. And I can say this, none of them agree with the onslaught that's happening when it comes to Black bodies in America, but they'll always ask, what do we need to do? Why is this happening, Kam? Why does it continue to happen? And that has to start with you, is how I answer that. Are you taking the time to step outside of your comfort zone of privilege, whatever that may look like, and get to sit down and sup with the next man or woman that is different from you? When you enter into those stores, is it automatically so prejudged that, you know what, I'm not going to take the time to get to know that kid over there because he's not dressed right, and to me he's perceived as a thug? Then you got to ask, what is the thug? As Langston said, America, right? If it's free for all of us, it takes in all of that, the differences. Are you taking the time with a coworker that is different from you in every way to value, see, and respect them and their experiences, whether they agree with you or not? Can you be that person that values, sees, and respects the differences from you so much that it goes beyond your political affiliation? Be it you're a proud Republican, be it you're a proud Democrat, be it you're a proud independent. Can you value, see, and respect the experiences of Black bodies and others so much that you can sit down and sup and have a conversation on different religious affiliations? Be it Christian, Muslim, Hebrew, or Catholic, or atheist. Can you love your God, your Yahweh, your Allah so much that you can have those conversations and value, see, and respect the experiences of others, but in particular, as I said, the Black experiences that are going on? And then you've got to ask yourself, after that, removing your privilege and the uncomfortability of not knowing, to take the time to allow in your heart to get to know them, to get to know someone different, to laugh, to cry, to stand, to fight. I think about Colin Kaepernick and him the last 6 to 7 seasons being unable to play in the the NFL, when he was simply saying the same thing that I'm saying. This is my way to protest, right? The injustices, the undervaluing of the Black bodies and the experiences here in America. He professionally did it. He silently did it. But yet he was removed from the NFL. And what would I say to that? The NFL is doing exactly what I just said. Not valuing, not seeing, not respecting the experiences. Instead of sitting down to sup, to understand Colin's side, where he was coming from, he was let go. But yet again, in the America, land of the free, it's ringing louder that the killings, the slaughter, the undervaluing, the demotion, the pushing aside and covering up the pain of a 400-year history still is not being talked about, still is not being seen. You would think with the current killings that are happening in the United States of Great America that Colin would have had an invite to the table. He would have been able to be a part of the conversation, but it hasn't. So again, all of these reasons are why there are Black bodies occupying, breathing, and moving right now, who are angry, who are tearing things up, who are hurt. And yes, again, stepping outside of what you feel is right or wrong. There is no right or wrong way. But you got to ask yourself this. A building can be replaced. A car can be replaced. Business insurance, which is money, right, can be replaced. But can a Black body that can't breathe, or is simply playing a video game in their home, who's been killed, can they be replaced? Value, see, respect the experiences of Black bodies here in the United States of America. And maybe, as Langston said, this land will truly be free for all, and it will be great again. Reflect, think about your own privilege and how you can turn that privilege into good. This has to start from the ground up. Being a Black woman married to a Black police officer who is incredible and would take a bullet for anyone. And for him to also say that, guess what I do for a living, taking a bullet for anybody regardless of race, needs reform. That should tell you something. White America, Black America, Brown America. Change has to start from the ground up. So with your policing, within your own communities, within businesses, within whatever sector that you are a part of, start valuing, start seeing, start respecting the experiences of Black bodies, the experiences of others who are different than you. And America will be America again for everyone, and the land of the free for everyone. Feel free to call me, 7145. Feel free to email me, kamwilliams@augustana.edu, to have that conversation. No matter how comfortable or uncomfortable it is, take the time to read. Take the time to sit and get to know your students and the pain that they are feeling. This is how that works. Have a good day.
Hello, I'm Dr. Wendy Hilton-Morrow. If you've seen me on campus, it's likely in my role as Provost and Dean of the College. However, I'm also a professor of communication studies with expertise in media and identity. In fact, I used to teach a first-year course by that very name. As we use the scholar's strike to learn about and reflect upon racism, white supremacy, and police brutality, I want us to think about the role media may play in all of this. According to the website Statista, people in the U.S. use digital media over 7 hours a day, and traditional media about 5 hours a day, and those numbers are only going up during the time of COVID. Now, it's pretty easy to dismiss that and say, but I just engage with the media for fun, to pass the time. It doesn't have any real effect on me. Well, I'm going to ask you not to be too dismissive of the role of media in our lives. Media are a social institution, similar to religion, schools, our families. By that I mean that media play an important role in how we're socialized, how we come to understand the world around us, how we understand ourselves, and how we understand each other. Now, from a critical cultural media perspective, we'd say that media play an ideological or ideological role. Either pronunciation is just fine. Now, let's unpack that a moment. Ideology refers to a dominant set of ideas, including values, beliefs, historical stories, ideas about social roles that work to maintain an existing set of power relations. That is, it's a way of thinking about the world, thinking about how it should be organized and what in that world should be most valued. So, for instance, one can point to racial ideologies. In our world, we've socially constructed notions of race based on perceived biological differences. That is, we have taken something like the amount of pigment in one's skin that's based simply on how far from the equator our ancestors lived, and we've organized that into a system that carries meaning, and it carries a lot of value judgments as well. So notions like white and black that are specific to our culture and to our point in history have come about. For example, we see suspicion about and devaluing of brown bodies in debates over immigration right now. But there was a time in this country when it was Italian and Irish immigrants who were viewed with suspicion and perhaps as not fully white. So we have to ask ourselves, what role might media play in constructing, reinforcing, or even challenging particular racial ideologies? Here's one thing to think about. The vast majority of us grew up in cities or at least neighborhoods that were racially and ethnically homogenous, meaning it was a lot of people who looked just like us. So geographically, our country still remains rather segregated, even in metropolitan areas. And I know that Dr. Chris Strunk in geography has done a video about this as part of Scholar Strike, and I sure hope you have a chance to watch that. So if we grew up in, or we live in communities of people who look very much like ourselves, how is it that we learn about those different from us? Well, research shows us that media help fill in the gaps. For instance, if I live in a community and work in a community that is primarily white, I don't have a chance to interact with people of different races, different ethnicities, or cultures from myself. I am more likely to believe the representations that I see in the media. Now, this can be both positive and negative. Let me give you an example. A friend of mine that I went to graduate school with was originally from Korea. Now, until he came over to the US, to New York, after his own college in Korea, his only knowledge of America and Americans was what he'd seen on television. Now, imagine this would have been in the late 80s, early 90s. He had shared with me that when he landed in New York, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He saw litter in the streets. He saw homeless people on the corners. Now, these are likely pretty familiar sights for those of us who've grown up in the US or who've lived in or visited larger metropolitan areas. But for him, the only America he'd ever experienced was that was depicted on television and in films. That's what America seemed like. It seemed like it must be perfect, full of wealthy people living in fancy apartments or homes, beautifully manicured suburbs, or spotless city streets. And that's not the reality, of course. So if we keep that example in mind as our context, I want you to think about how media portray Black people. Now, fortunately, we live during a time, partly due to the proliferation of media outlets that we've seen, that it's not difficult to think about television programs or films that feature Black characters, even in lead roles. And this is absolutely a sign of progress. However, I want to take a closer look at some of the representations of Black men in particular, because they often reinforce a view of them, unfortunately, as being dangerous or as being criminals. For example, research done on the HBO crime drama The Wire, which aired from 2002 to 2008, found that it reinforced racial ideologies about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. The show's official website listed cast members under two groups: the law, most of whom were police officers, and the street. Of the 25 characters listed under the law, about 2/3 of the police officers were white males. Now, this is a stark contrast to the characters listed under the street. All but about 3 of the 21 characters listed here were African American men. Now, this study is not unique. Study after study finds that it's Black men who are overrepresented as criminals in fictionalized media depictions. It's also in reality programs and even in news coverage. Now, Robert Entman uses the concept of framing to help us think about what might be happening here. Let me quote from him. To frame is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in communicating a text in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment or recommendation for the item described. So if we use Entman's concept of framing, we need to pay attention to how media is portraying people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Now, it is absolutely clear that the Black man as a criminal is unfortunately a common media frame. It's one that reflects often unconscious bias of media producers who are often white, and even journalists. Now, it's also a frame that dates back more than 100 years. If we think about the first, what we would call blockbuster film, it was probably a silent film from 1915 called The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. The movie was screened at the White House by President Wilson. All 9 of the Supreme Court justices and many members of Congress attended screenings of this film. This film featured Black-faced actors, that is, white men with Black makeup, as criminals and rapists, all after white women. The KKK was portrayed as the savior of white women, and a number of historians suggest that this film was actually responsible for strengthening the KKK during that time. Now I know that was over 100 years ago. So what about today? Well, Blacks are overrepresented as perpetrators of violent crime when news coverage is compared with actual arrest rates. But they are underrepresented in the more sympathetic roles of victim or as law enforcer. Or in a sample of television news stories in Chicago, it found that stories about Blacks were 4 times more likely to include mugshots than similar stories about white people who had been arrested for similar crimes. Media can unfortunately also stoke white fears about Black people. Murder, for instance, is largely an interracial crime. That is, you are more likely to be killed by someone of your own race. However, news media overreports the less common cases of Black people committing homicide against white people. So what's the impact of these racialized representations of crime? Now, it's always hard to draw a direct causational link to the societal effects of media representations. However, here's what we do know. So a media theorist by the name of George Gerbner developed the concept of the mean world syndrome. He consistently found that the more media that people watch, the more dangerous they actually believe the real world is. So high media users overestimate levels of dangerous crime. Studies continue to find correlational connections between media use and perceptions of crime. For instance, surveys found that heavy viewers of news are more likely to support the use of the death penalty in a hypothetical situation. So take a moment and think about the potential impact of media framing of Black men as criminals, as thugs, as dangerous to white people. This image of white vision glasses here, it very sadly reflects the way that white people have been conditioned to see Black people by the media. Now, lay this alongside what we know about people's racial perceptions and behaviors. Things like the fact that white people frequently call the cops on innocent Black people, that police arrest, assault, or kill Black people at disproportionately higher rates when they're called, that juries convict Black people at high rates, that judges sentence Black people to longer sentences, that schools suspend Black students at disproportionately higher rates. Yes, it's pretty depressing. In fact, it's heartbreaking. It might feel like it's impossible to alter this force of culture, but I do think there's a reason for hope here, and there are things that we can all do. Now, first, we are increasingly seeing representations of Black men that counter the framing of Black men as criminals. We have Black men in leading roles in a Star Wars film, in Marvel films, even in reimagining our founding fathers. These images matter. And you can make a difference in all of this. Maybe you're studying creative writing. Maybe it's entertainment and media studies, or perhaps multimedia journalism. You may one day be producing the images we're seeing in the media. You can be thoughtful about the ideological implications of media images and the intended and the unintended consequences of media framing. Now, even if we're not creators or never will be creators of media, we are all consumers of media, and we can vote with our eyeballs. One of the reasons that it's taken this long to see as many strong Black leading characters in film and in television shows is because largely white media producers assumed they wouldn't appeal to broad audiences. So continue to prove them wrong and give them financial incentive to feature diverse casts in rich roles. Similarly, don't support media that reinforce harmful racial depictions. And when you see them, call them out. Point it out to your friends so that they start to recognize these depictions and see them as harmful. Finally, Make sure you're building meaningful relationships with people who are different from you. If you have that, then mediated representations will simply have less impact on you. Instead, you'll have real people, complex people that you can learn about and that you can learn from. It's only by seeing those different from ourselves as fully human that we'll be able to end things like racism and police brutality. I thank you for your time.
Hi, I'm Dave Dehnel. I teach in the political science department here at Augustana. And, we've been asked to contribute to our ongoing conversation about issues of racial justice, particularly today in connection with the criminal justice system. I teach law and politics. It is my field. I'm not an expert on criminal justice, but I do pay a lot of attention to it. And I hope I can, contribute to the conversation and prod some thinking. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through some big patterns in the criminal justice system and raise some questions about institutional racism. That is, ways in which the structure, the deep structure of our institutions and culture create racial injustice. And this can happen and does happen without overt racism, without people saying racist things, or even making conscious racial judgments necessarily. And so that's even without that, the deep role that race plays in the structure of our society can produce racial injustice, and that's what institutional racism is. And so that's what I'm going to move us toward as we talk about our criminal justice system. Before I forget, I would suggest, if you're interested in this, that my own opinion is the best starting place is Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. It's a book I do use in one of my classes, and I think is a must read, really, with respect to the conversation about race and criminal justice. I'll be showing you a series of charts today, and I'd be happy to let you know, what my sources are as far as all of this stuff. So I'm gonna start off with this chart that we have up right now, which is incarceration rates. This is simply what proportion of the population is in prison or jail at any given moment, and this is a chart that just knocked me over when I first saw it some years ago. That the United States imprisons a lot of people. You can see, here we are, the United States up here, and the state of Illinois, which a little bit lower than the national average, but, far above these countries, other countries in this chart. We imprison a lot of people, and there are a number of reasons for that. We have somewhat higher crime rates in the United States. However, a substantial part of the difference is because we have much stricter punishments in the United States. We criminalize more behavior, and when convict somebody, we sentence them to long prison sentences compared to other countries. There's a myth, I don't know if it's widespread today anymore, about people getting off lightly in our judicial system, and that is simply not true. The punishments for crime in the United States are very severe. And so you can see this, this broad pattern here of that we have a lot of Americans incarcerated. So I'm going to look a little bit behind that, and one of the factors just to note here is that this is a recent phenomenon, actually, in U.S. history. I mean, it's always been somewhat true, or long term somewhat true, but this is really incarceration has really leapt since 1980. This is 1980 in this chart. And as you can see, incarceration in federal prisons, in jails, local jails, and especially in state prisons, just climbed rapidly from 1980 to 2000. It's leveled off since then. It's actually come down a little bit in recent years. But, I mean, this is, it's a fairly recent phenomenon, and we can really date this big turning point to 1980. By the way, the difference between local jail and a state prison is that typically people who have been convicted of a felony are going to end up in prison, and misdemeanors or lesser crimes in local jails. So it's, it really kicks in 1980. Okay, so let's talk about race. This is a chart that shows incarceration rates by race, and this is since 1980. So this is during the period of the upswing in incarceration. And as you can see, the blue part of the line here is whites. The green is Hispanic. This is the males chart for males. Incarceration rates for males are generally speaking 10 times or so that of females. And then you have black males. And as you can see, there's always been a gap, and that gap grew rapidly in the 80s and 90s. Black incarceration went up very much more so than white. White incarceration increased during this time, by the way. But it's, a huge increase among blacks. There's been some decline, I would say, since the early 2000s. However, even, here as we get to the end, the most recent data, we're still talking about a 6 times higher incarceration rate for black males than white males, and 3 times almost, maybe 2.5 to 3 times higher for Hispanic males. So the behind that picture of lots of incarceration in the United States, we have a very strong racial pattern. Now, I should say that this chart is per person. It's the rate of incarceration. And so, even though the rate for whites looks low here, I mean, there's still a lot of white people in jail and prison in the United States. And so the criminal justice system impacts all segments of our population, but obviously not equally. Well, why is this? What is happening here? And this is, what I want to really emphasize a couple of things about this. And one of the striking things is that the crime rate is not an explanation for the pattern of incarceration in the United States. Crime rates compared 1980 to 2000 are not higher. In fact, they're lower. That period of big increase in incarceration was not due to a wave of crime. It was due to changes in public policy. That's why we see this big increase in people in jail, and there's a number of different public policy changes. One of those is just stricter punishments for crime. We expanded the length of prison sentences and took away discretion of judges to give people sort of a second chance. Thing we made mandatory sentences, those kind of laws. So public policies changed, which made the criminal justice system more prone to incarceration, rather than it being driven by a wave of crime. Now, another aspect of public policy that was clearly very important is the war on drugs. We vastly increased the criminalization of drug use and selling, greatly increased the punishments for those activities. I call them activities. We assume they're crimes in the United States, which is not assumed in every country. So this chart shows, and remember that incarceration increased most rapidly by far for blacks. during this time period. And this chart shows what crimes more arrests were being made for, and arrests don't line up one-to-one with incarceration, I should say. But nonetheless, this is an indicator that drug enforcement is a big deal. It's had a tremendous impact on African Americans, and so you can see here that if you look on the right side of this chart, for violent crimes, the arrest rate for blacks actually declined slightly from 1980 to 2011. For property crimes, declined slightly. The number of arrests declined slightly. But then when we look to the drug abuse side, drug possession and other drug violations, there you see these big increases in the rates of arrest. And so the so-called war on drugs, a public policy decision which has had a tremendous impact and continues to have a tremendous impact on African American communities. So why? What's going on? Can we explain the arrests by the crime? Is it that there's this huge problem of drug abuse in central cities, and that's why there's this tremendous wave of arrests, and why the drug war was launched, and so on. And the truth is there's a lack of evidence to support that. These are this is a chart. This is for 2015, very recent data. On the left side, you have the results of surveys that are done of the population, and have been done for many years, asking about drug use and even drug selling. And what this indicates is that the acknowledgement of drug use in these surveys between blacks and whites is pretty close, and actually whites are a little higher here. The acknowledgement of drug use is drug selling is similar for blacks and whites. But then over here, what we see is these are the drug related arrests, and they're broken down, as you can see, much higher for blacks than whites, and the same for incarceration. And so, when you look at these numbers, they're shocking to me. I mean, they're shocking. They need to be addressed. But you might say, well, but people aren't going to tell the truth, if you ask them if they're using drugs. And that's a valid point. It's hard to get an independent measure of drug use. But here's my challenge. Well, if you don't think these numbers are right, come up with some evidence. We need, what we can't do is just assume that blacks are using lots of drugs, and therefore that explains the arrests, until you prove to me that I'm wrong. I have some evidence here, and it's disturbing. And so how do we address that? To me, the danger of it, and this is where the institutional racism really comes in, is that I'm guilty of this too. I sit here thinking central cities, high crime area, poor schools, family problems. No wonder those people use drugs. And it's a shame, and we should do something about it. And maybe we shouldn't be arresting them. We should be doing something else. But I'm working with this mindset that says, yeah, drugs, it's a black problem, isn't it? Or at least it's a bigger problem for the blacks. That's where this institutional racism, I think, really is so real. And we need to have a conversation here. And in the end, I go back to that first chart, incarceration, the huge number of just the fact that we have so many in jail. Why do we accept this? Why do we accept it? Is it because it's so heavily black that it's these people who live somewhere else who have all these problems? It's not me. Is that why we accept it? So these are hard questions. I feel like they have to be asked, and I hope we can and begin to address them. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dr. Sharon Varallo from Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. I'm here to talk about racism and mass incarceration during COVID-19. A lot of this information that I'm about to present comes from Prison Policy Initiative, and it has a treasure trove of information if you're interested in looking up any of these claims or finding some more data for your own work. Their work can be found at prisonpolicy.org. Today in the United States, we have incarcerated more people than any other country on earth. 1 out of 5 prisoners in the world is incarcerated in the United States, nearly 2.2 million people. So there are a lot of ways to cut up the pie to sort of understand the whole picture of mass incarceration in the United States. But one thing to remember is that the number that you often see in front of you is a chart of people currently behind bars, currently in a cage. So state prisons have well over 1 million people. Local jails have well over 600,000 people in them. Federal prisons and jails have a smaller percentage, but still quite a number of people, over 200,000 people. And so these charts tell us a whole lot about the massive nature of incarceration in this country. But one thing that it doesn't always tell you is the ongoing nature of it. So someone who is no longer counted as part of one of these statistics is still feeling the effects. That can be true for the effects of COVID, what we'll be talking about later on. But that's just one thing to remember. So incarceration rates, as you see, the United States far outpaces all other countries in the world. In fact, each state in the United States can count on its own in comparison to other countries. The state of Illinois, for example, incarcerates more people than every country on the planet except for 3 countries. So, I mean, we are certainly over-incarcerating, and it's just a fact. Unless somebody thinks that Americans by nature are that much more evil or that much more in need of correction than anybody else on the globe, then something's wrong here. We're doing something wrong. So here in Illinois, how many Illinois residents are locked up and where? 76,000 Illinois residents are locked up in different kind of facilities. And again, 41,000 of those are in state prisons. Like I said previously, though, that number is just a portion of people who are feeling the effects of and so on probation, we have a number of folks who are still involved currently in the criminal justice system and sometimes being unduly affected by public health crises as well. So what about this racial disparity? This is a chart from 2010. Most of the charts that I've shared with you have been from 2018 and 2019. This particular chart is from 2010 because it was calculated from the U.S. Census. And you can see the massive disparity of incarceration by race and ethnicity. Mind you, people are not differently made. There are no biological markers of race. There's no subspecies of human. We know that by now, right? And we are often talking about the same crimes, right? And over-incarcerating and incarcerating for longer periods of time for all of our citizens, and especially so for Black and brown families who live below the poverty line. So this chart, from originally printed in the Washington Post, talks about same crimes, different times, and shows the percentage difference in sentence length for Black men versus white men with similar backgrounds who commit the same crimes. And you see here that the most recent one was over 19% longer. That is, Black American men serve 19% longer than white American men for the same crimes. Okay? We have an incarceration system that over-incarcerates anyway. But then, I mean, the way that we are abusing Black and brown families in this country and calling it criminal justice is really a national tragedy. Also remember that 95% of felony convictions in the U.S. are obtained through guilty pleas. What does that mean? It means almost nobody goes to trial anymore. It means that before you get to that place, you are presented with an offer, and maybe you're overcharged with something, and they'll say, hey, if you take this plea deal, we won't charge you for this huge crime, but just say guilty. Just say guilty, and you'll get this smaller crime. And 95% of, as you see in the federal system in particular, people take the plea. Because are they willing to risk life imprisonment, for example? And in this process as well, police disproportionately target Black Americans. Now, this has come to light more because of recent documentary and other filmmakers' reenactments here. Ava DuVernay's 2019 When They See Us was groundbreaking for many mainstream Americans who may have remembered, some of us who are older, may have remembered the quote-unquote Central Park 5 case. A white jogger, a white woman who was jogging in New York City, was brutally attacked, raped, and attempted murder. It was just an awful, awful, awful crime. And these boys were coerced into confessing to this crime they did not commit. It is a very difficult to watch, but it is very important to watch, and shows a bit of the interrogation technique that was used against these boys, which was and is legal. It was and is still practiced, including in the Quad Cities. Now, the physical violence has never been supposed to be a part of it, right? But it is legal for police to lie to you, and when you are a 14-year-old child, or 15 or 16, or even in your 20s or 30s, all of us are susceptible to the interrogation practices of the Reed technique of interrogation. All of us are. And so the New York Times last year in 2019 published a story, and part of the title was "We Were Just Baby Boys." And you see in this picture the grown men, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCrae, Yusef Salem, and Corey Wise, who were 14, 15, and 16 years old when they were subjected to this interrogation. And part of it was just overzealousness, police wanting to solve crimes and thinking that they saw guilt, that they saw crime in these young boys' faces. And it was absolute tragedy and is not, unfortunately, an anomaly. That was in New York. Here in Chicago, we had the really difficult case of another violent rape and murder here, and was here pictured here is Harold Richardson, Vincent Thames, Terrell Swift, and Michael Sanders. And they were convicted and spent nearly 16 years in prison before they were exonerated. And these young men had nothing to do with that crime. So only in recent years have there been enough reports and enough media attention made so that some of this abuse is now being rectified. But how do you get over spending 16 years in prison? It's not as if you get your life back, right? And so we have thousands and thousands and thousands of cases where people are pleading innocence, like the Innocence Project sorts of organizations all over the country are working diligently case by case, but we still have cases of actual innocence in our prisons that take years to work through. So what you see on the screen here is an NPR story about the Justice Department investigation finding a pattern of abuse by Chicago police. Just this year, 2020, Dr. Lawrence Ralph, who's a Princeton professor of anthropology, published a book called The Torture Letters, Reckoning with Police Violence, which is about torture in Chicago, decades-long police-sanctioned torture that we are still very much dealing with today. I'm going to read from the description of the torture letters. Torture is an open secret in Chicago. Between 1972 and 1991, at least 125 black suspects were tortured by Chicago police officers working under former police commander John Burge. That brutal period is far from a historical anomaly. For more than 50 years, police officers who took an oath to protect and serve have instead beaten, electrocuted, suffocated, and raped hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Chicago residents. In the torture letters, Dr. Lawrence Ralph chronicles the history of torture in Chicago, the burgeoning activist movement against police violence, and the American public's complicity in perpetuating torture at home and abroad. And I'm going to say that last section again. The American public's complicity in perpetuating torture at home and abroad. This mess is for all of us to clean up. This mess has been going on for so long, and it needs to be both accounted for and cleaned up. Again, torture is an open secret. The violence that has been directed, it's interesting the narratives that we have very often about incarcerated people, the words that we use, ex-cons, that you are an offender, that you are this crime, right? That you are that in your person. Language can be violent, of course, and most of the violence that we associate with incarceration is that which we associate with whatever we imagine they've done. Now, certainly, there absolutely are violent offenders who are in prison, and I would argue we need to have prisons. But I refuse to believe that Americans and that are so much worse than any other country on the planet that we have to put people in cages. And I absolutely know, as we all do now, biologically, races are not made differently. We are not made differently. There is no genetic division among human beings. But we have social conditions of poverty and high crime being associated with poverty, lack of education be associated with poverty, lack of ability to own a home, etc., etc. We have many social contexts that complicate the scenario. So I would ask us to not just imagine that people inside prisons are violent, right? And that very often violence has been directed at them before, during, and after incarceration. So what about this notion of COVID-19 that bringing all of this to a head, right? And perhaps you've heard about compassionate release under COVID-19. Some states have reduced jail populations. Remember the difference between prison and jail. Jail is where you go before you've been convicted of a crime. Supposedly you are innocent until you're proven guilty. That doesn't mean that some people haven't spent years in jail awaiting a decision, right? Because we have a money bail system. So some states, anyway, have reduced jail populations, but no state has significantly reduced their prison population, regardless of what it looks like on paper. So this is an ACLU report of all 50 states' COVID responses. And this is from prisonpolicy.org. And the ACLU report says the results are clear. State responses ranged to COVID-19, that is, to the pandemic and the petri dishes that our that are our prisons and jails. The results of states' efforts are clear. State responses ranged from disorganized or ineffective at best to callously non-existent at worst. Even using data from criminal justice system agencies, that is, the state's own versions of this story, it is clear that no state has done enough and that all states failed to implement a cohesive system-wide response. So again, in some states we observed significant jail population reductions, yet no state had close to adequate prison population reductions, despite some governors issuing orders or guidance that on their face were intended to release people more quickly. Universal testing was also scarce, and very few states offered transparency about testing and release. There are organizations right now, and there's advocacy right now to help encourage governors to act more quickly and departments of correction all over the country, including the 49th anniversary of an Attica prison uprising, where activists are hoping to garner public attention to save lives by reducing our prison populations. The spread of COVID-19 inside prisons and jails, where social distancing and other prevention measures are virtually impossible, has infected over 150,000 people, and many have suffered preventable deaths. Social distancing is not possible in prison or jail. The average free space in an average cell doesn't even reach 6 feet. There's not enough soap, not enough sanitizer. Educators, in fact, have been turning their attention to soap and sanitizer campaigns to keep their students who are incarcerated alive. Those students are human beings. Those incarcerated people are human beings, and they deserve to be mourned. Those who lose their lives. It's hard to imagine the losses of millions of Americans as they are awaiting word because they can't visit their loved ones who are, lockdowns in prisons and jails. And it's hard to imagine in part because we have such a singular story about incarcerated people. It's such a story of evil and violence. And I'm going to share with you some pictures of some lives that were lost to COVID in prison. These men and women were all ages, all races, religions, walks of life. They are fathers and mothers, brothers and sons. They have hobbies and vibrant lives and loves. They had bright futures. All these people are gone. This man was a student at Stateville here in Illinois, at Stateville Correctional Center in Joliet. They had loved ones. Human beings. What you can't quite see on the screen is a common refrain: you do the crime, you do the time. Even if that's something that's a way of thinking that you agree with, incarceration very often results in a lifelong sentence. And incarceration now during COVID-19 shouldn't be a death penalty. It's up to all of us to get involved. Thank you for your time. And please, I encourage you very much to get involved.
Hello, my name is Kathy Webb, and I am an assistant professor in communication sciences and disorders at Augustana College. I am also a disability studies scholar and identify as a disabled person myself. For access purposes, I'd like to describe myself. I am a white woman with medium long brown hair that is kind of curly at certain times of day. I have on glasses that are blue on top and more tortoiseshell on the bottom, and I'm wearing a green top and sitting in front of a brick wall. I wanted to talk to you today about some of the injustice that we're seeing right now regarding policing. I know there's been a lot of conversation and a lot of demonstrations, and I'm really, proud to see so many people out supporting the movements that are working toward creating a more just society. But one of the issues that's not always brought up is that many people who experience violence from the police are also disabled. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today and give you some understanding of how this is an issue that faces people of color in an extra layer of discrimination. So what we do know is that Black people are 5 times more likely to experience being stopped by the police for a reason that they think is just race as compared to white people. And we know that Black people are also 2.5 times more likely than white people to be killed by the police or by some law enforcement officer. But what many people don't know is that approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of all deaths by police are experienced by people with disabilities, many of whom are also people of color. There are lots of reasons why this might be. Some of it is that the police are not equipped to handle mental health crises. And so oftentimes when they experience or are called to a scene to help somebody during a mental health crisis, they don't have the tools for that. And because they don't understand what's happening, they often misinterpret what is going on. And that results very frequently in the death of people who literally called the police for help or whose loved ones called the police for help because they didn't know how to handle a crisis. Other times it's things like somebody with autism who is flapping or moving their hands to stimulate themselves, to calm themselves, and the police see that gesture as threatening. We've also seen lots of other cases around other disabilities where the police just misunderstood what was happening. This happens all the time in the deaf community, where police pull over someone who is deaf and they don't have a chance to even communicate to the police officers that they are deaf before they are threatened or pulled out of their car or experience some other kind of violence. And some have lived through that and some have died because of that. It's a very serious crisis that is impacting a lot of people. You know, I am fortunate. I'm very privileged as a white person, but I do have family members who are Black and who are mixed race, and I worry for them as they grow up. And so this is an issue that I find to be really important and so under-discussed. A couple of years ago, I went and attended a training that was supposed to help university faculty and workers to understand how to help somebody who's having a mental health crisis. And beyond university, it's also the same people who train the police oftentimes in these crises, and also community members who are interested in learning about this. And while I didn't particularly care for the training for many reasons, one of the things that struck me the hardest was that when an inquiry by me was made about what to do if you are with somebody for whom it is not safe to call 911. What do I do if I'm with a Black or brown friend who's having a mental health crisis and they need assistance that I cannot provide to them because I am not a licensed and trained counselor? But it's not safe for me to call 911 knowing what their experiences often are. And the response that I got was, you should call 911. We trained the police, they should know how to do this. And that is just not the case. A 2-3 hour training one time every few years doesn't make anybody qualified to help somebody in the middle of a crisis, let alone somebody who is also being required to do 12 million other things and is trained to think defensively first. And so I think this is an issue that we need to be discussing more. Many of the talks around defunding the police are centering around this idea that mental health crises aren't best handled by the police, that there are other people who can handle that. And for people with disabilities, especially psychiatric disabilities, that is a real need and a huge problem where they do not feel safe having the police called, even if they're calling for an ambulance, but the police always accompany and sometimes beat an ambulance to the scene. And EMTs aren't always trained well either in mental health crises. And it's just something that we know how to solve, and we haven't moved anything forward in doing that. So this double discrimination that is faced by so many people who are disabled and people of color is a real problem. And one of the things that we notice a lot in the media and in reporting is that people are either Black or disabled. They are brown or disabled. Very oftentimes, even if people have these underlying conditions that would protect them under the Americans with Disabilities Act, those aren't things that we notice. We hide or push away that part of that person and don't bring it into the conversation, and we don't bring it up when we think about these people and we remember their lives that have been lost. So we're denying part of their identity, part of who they are in many cases. For people who identify as disabled and are part of that culture, that's a very big deal. And for people who don't, it still means that we're ignoring services and systems that would benefit them, that would support them, that would help keep them safe. So they end up having this double layer of discrimination that makes police interactions so much more volatile and so much more scary and hard to make it through alive, apparently. And this is a real problem that sincerely needs to change. There's so much good work being done by so many people around this right now. And it's just my hope that the stigma around disability will slowly vanish and allow us to have these intersectional conversations where we can discuss the whole person and the needs that come from that. I hope that we consider how things like the current COVID-19 crisis are creating more people with disabilities. Not everybody dies, but not everybody survives with no complications either. And so this is more opportunities where we know that Black and brown people are disproportionately affected, which means that most likely they will disproportionately be the people left with disabilities. And we need to be figuring out and developing services and supports that can assist them to live the best lives possible, because disabled lives are not terrible. I enjoy my life, and many of my disabled friends do as well. And I hope that we can change that frame of reference, and most especially in communities of color, because there is such a need for services and support and understanding and reform and change that works for the better and creates a more equal society. I hope that this was informative and maybe some new information for you. But what I would like to end with is by just naming a few people who have been killed by the police who were also disabled individuals. And maybe some of them are names that you're familiar with, but you didn't know that that person had a disability. And I hope that this just raises some awareness and recognition that this is a problem that resides along with the other systemic problems that we're currently working against. So here are some of the people who have passed away because of police violence who are also disabled. Deborah Danner, Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, Tanisha Anderson, Jamarion Robinson, Mario Woods, Charlena Lyles, Kayla Moore, Ezel Ford, Alfred Olango, Keith Lamont Scott, George Floyd, Reginald Thomas, Caldrick Donald. There are many more people who belong on that list and whose lives deserve to be recognized and remembered, and who very much deserve systemic change, as they gave their lives for really no good reason, many of them, having left behind family and friends who I can't even imagine the devastation that they must be feeling. We definitely need to do something, and I hope that having this awareness about how disability is very prominent and present in many of these cases and in so many other cases, whether the person is Black or brown or Indigenous, as well as people who are white, is a systemic issue that needs changing, and I hope that it's something that we can work toward as we work toward a more just world. Thank you for listening.
My name is Elizabeth Lawrence. I'm a historian of modern China at Augustana College. And as a historian, I would like to start with a story from the past. On June 19, 1982, a Chinese-American man named Vincent Chin went to a Detroit bar to celebrate his bachelor party. He was joined by Gary Koivu, a childhood friend who was to be his best man. Years later, Koivu would recall the events of that night for an NPR StoryCorps interview. We were having a good time and listening to the music, but there was an auto worker, and he said to Vincent, "Because of little motherfuckers like you, a lot of Americans are losing their jobs." This was around the time that Japanese cars first started to seriously compete with the Detroit-based U.S. auto industry. In Koivu's words again, Vincent wasn't Japanese, he was Chinese, but that didn't matter. He was Asian. Later we were outside and the man went straight to the car and pulled out a baseball bat and started racing toward Vincent, and Vincent ran. But they found him. I don't know how many times he hit him in the head, but he was swinging the baseball bat like he was swinging for a home run. Still hurts just talking about it. Left an empty hole in my heart. These men that killed him, they were given probation and a fine for what they had done, and that was like a punch in the gut. This is a story I've told to students before. It is a story I feel a sort of compulsion to tell. A compulsion to say his name, Vincent Chin. But let me be clear. Even though racist incidents against people of Asian descent have been on the rise in the past year, stoked by those who would call the global pandemic of COVID-19 the Chinese virus, this moment, this teach-in is first and foremost about acknowledging the persistent violence against Black people perpetrated in this country. And that is why I wish to speak to you today on the subject of Asian studies and Black Lives Matter. I like to say that Asian history is a part of our shared global history. The world has long been interconnected, and for that reason, the history of Asia is not complete without the history of Black people. Some may find this surprising. Although Asia is a world region of incredible diversity, people tend to think they know what an Asian person should look like, particularly an East Asian person, something like Vincent Chin. When you think of a Japanese woman, what image comes to mind? Do you picture someone like the woman in the background or the woman in the foreground? They are mother and daughter. Naomi Osaka is a Japanese woman and a Black woman. And as I speak, she is currently crushing it at the tennis US Open, having just moved on to the round of 16. An engaged social justice advocate, the 22-year-old Osaka is donning the mask of a different victim of police violence each time she takes the court in New York. Over the years, Osaka has faced a lot of skepticism, a lot of hate, both in and outside of Japan. People find it hard to accept that this woman, daughter of a Japanese mother and a Haitian father, is truly Japanese. I'm here to tell you, she is. The intermixing that produced Naomi Osaka, that produced myself as a half-Asian person, isn't just a recent phenomenon. Connections between, say, China and Africa date back centuries. As China's global connections thickened in the past 100 years, some of the cultural influences on China that are too often folded into the problematic term westernization were in fact very distinctly African American cultural influences, such as the jazz that was played in the dance halls of 1930s Shanghai, which in turn inspired some of the most innovative Chinese modernist literature of that period. During World War II and the Korean War, African Americans fought in the then segregated U.S. military. One such man who fought in Korea was Clarence Adams. He was captured and became a prisoner of war. But when the fighting ended and he was free to go home, he stayed instead amongst his former captors, living in China for years. This Black man felt that he would always be a second-class citizen in America, that he had a better chance of achieving some version of the American dream in Asia. In the 1960s, a decade of global radicalism and Cold War tensions, Mao's China actively promoted anti-colonial African independence movements, and also produced propaganda drawing attention to US-based protest movements. And in turn, Black radicals studied the doctrines of Maoism, while over the years prominent Black intellectuals and cultural icons, from W.E.B. Du Bois to Muhammad Ali, visited China. But here this talk has to take a turn. I can't pretend to be teaching you this history. I am learning it one step ahead of you. I have not deeply studied these topics. But here are two people who have. Robeson Taj Frazier, author of The East is Black, Cold War China in the Black Radical Imagination, and Keisha A. Brown, author of Blackness in Exile, W.E.B. Du Bois's Role in the Formation of Representations of Blackness as Conceptualized by the Chinese Communist Party. I would not have been inspired to give this talk had it not been for the participation of Dr. Brown and others in a roundtable on the topic of Asian studies and Black Lives Matter in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The very title of my presentation comes word for word from that roundtable, not because I wish to appropriate, but because I wish to amplify the voices of these terrific scholars. Dr. Brown also contributed to a terrific web guide on teaching China through Black history that I will certainly be referencing when I prepare to teach modern Chinese history in the future. Some of the images I've showed come straight from that resource. And so here's one thing I want to emphasize. Black academics spend so much time educating not only their students, but also their colleagues, and often with little reward. And they do so while conducting themselves with endless grace, even as they have to listen day after day to stories about Black people dying at the hands of those who should protect, even as they themselves daily face the very real threat of racial profiling. On August 22, 2020, a Black professor at Santa Clara University named Danielle Morgan was in her own home when campus security came to the door, having followed her brother there, because they could not believe that a Black man had a legitimate reason to be on that campus. In a Twitter thread recounting the incident, Dr. Morgan wrote, "I asked what the issue was, and he said, my brother was in the bushes, and it was suspicious, and they thought he may have been homeless. I asked why I needed to show ID at my own home. He said, well, it's not your home. The university owns it." It was faculty housing. To students of color, here is one message I would like to send to you today. You can be anything. Don't let the stereotypes that the world will put on you define you. You can be an athlete. You can be a doctor like Arturo Holmes, who wrote an op-ed this summer about how he wears scrubs all the time because it makes him safer from racial profiling. You can be a scholar of Asian studies just as well as I can. But let us all remember these words of Danielle Morgan, who in the wake of her own racial profiling incident said this: "The reason my story is widespread, people see my brother is a musician, he's performed in Carnegie Hall, won awards, teaches piano lessons, and I am an Ivy League educated professor and think we make ideal victims because it's easy to say it shouldn't have happened to us. But this shouldn't happen to anyone, regardless of their education or their standing. This is egregious because this should not happen to Black people, period." When a Black woman like Danielle Morgan is harassed in her own home by campus security, that is not maintaining law and order. When a Black woman like Breonna Taylor is killed in her own home by police, that is not maintaining law and order. Quite the contrary. It is a criminal offense. I can't speak from a criminal justice perspective, but to my mind, it is murder. Just as the killing of Vincent Chin by baseball bat outside a Detroit bar in 1982 was murder. Again, my name is Elizabeth Lawrence. You can contact me with questions, or if you are curious about any of the sources referenced in this talk, at my Augustana College email address. Thank you for watching.